Hey everybody, I've had a couple of people recently ask me what the difference is between hex and horizontal stack. So, first off, the obvious difference is the shape or the formation. When the disc's in the center of the field in hex, then those two players who in horizontal are like the handlers to either side, they're pushed up slightly. This has the benefit of them being connected to the other players. So if there's a poach and those players get passed to immediately, then they're in a good position connected with other players to keep the disc moving. I've seen before these players be poached off in horizontal and their reaction to actually is to move back. But then when they get passed to, they're disconnected from the rest of the players and it causes a halt in flow. Obviously, downfield, it looks very different as well. That could look like horizontal in mid flow, but we'll get to that in a little bit. When the disc's on the sideline, it looks very different, right? In hex, you've got two players behind the disc. In horizontal, you have two players level with the disc, and then all the other players downfield. In hex, you've got two players level with the disc, but you've got two players behind and two in front. So that's very different, and that's often actually something that teams transitioning from horizontal to hex get wrong when the disc moves to the sideline. When the disc is then in the midway point between the center and the sideline, then you have these two layers of players downfield. In this position, you could call it a 2-3-2, but it's not great to think about hex in that kind of way because it's not really a formation as such. Secondly, the movement principles in hex are very different. So all offenses like moving the disc quickly, but in hex, the principles and the movement decision tree lay out exactly how to achieve this. It's built into the offense, and the shape of hex supports and facilitates that movement. Movement is actually more important than shape in hex. So there's a question like, why is the offense called hex instead of being called motion? And I'll get to that in a minute. Going back to talking about how horizontal can look like hex when players start cutting, it's good to ask why we even have a horizontal stack. Originally we had vertical stack, and the transition from then was to actually just rotate this 90 degrees, so then it became a horizontal stack using the space in a different way. This was a relatively easy to imagine change, and it meant that the teams could keep their handler and cutter divisions that they have in vert and just play from a spread setup. Now we know that host stack works best when the players are out of position mid-flow, so then we've got to ask ourselves, why do we have those positions in mind? Hex is a way of viewing the space on the field which breaks out of that line-based paradigm and shifts into triangles, which simply work better when operating in real-world space and time. With hex, you don't need to learn the rules in order to break them and know when to break them. Instead, you can just follow the principles and the guidelines, and they'll always apply and they'll always facilitate good flow. So if flow and movement are more important than shape, then why is the offense called hex? Well, it's basically meeting traditional offenses halfway. Traditional offenses are defined by their shape, right? So stacks are side stack, vertical stack, split stack. They're all descriptive of where the players are on the field. Hex is also that, is in that same realm, so therefore would be easier to understand for players who are familiar with offenses just describing how the players are set up. Really, it would make more sense if hex was just considered as a way of viewing space on the field. So multiple offenses could be hex-based with different principles and focuses, and even different distributions of players. But instead of the space being viewed as vertical or horizontal, spaces are thought of as roughly circular areas. So maybe a better way of describing what we currently know as hex would be a flow-based or a motion-based offense. And this kind of leads me into the last point. The word hex is a bit of a dirty word, right? You mention hex at training, and there's a fair chance that you were met with some confusion and sometimes just flat out refusal to cooperate. When I teach beginners, I don't mention hex, the shape, the full shape, until almost a couple of months in. With new players, there's not really any need for that. You can just talk about spacing, you can talk about connections. You don't need to go into the full formation because they haven't picked up any of the bad habits of clustering and such from playing stack offense for a few years. I know there are many coaches of experienced players who will get their team playing Hex without ever mentioning the word Hex, knowing that there may be an adverse reaction. Instead, they focus on the movement principles, they focus a bit on spacing, and just avoid using the word Hex. And it makes sense, right? It's true, knowledge of the overall shape of Hex can be a bit more of a distraction than a benefit, as it gets players considering the offense from static disc situations. That's how they kind of view the offense is going to be, like the disc is here, everyone stands in these positions. It's not really what it's about, right? You should aim to keep the disc moving and then view the space on the field from that kind of Hex mindset. If you go too deep into the structure, then players are distracted from that. And on the field, they're thinking about abstract global formations rather than the spacing directly in front of and around them as they play. Now, I've taken a deep dive into playing and coaching Hex for over 10 years now, and I spare no detail when trying to explain what it's taught me over these years. How equal spacing between players leads to rhythmic timing and flow, how keeping the disc moving increases efficiency and sustains the offense advantage over the defense, and how occupying spaces rather than keeping spaces clear creates a more robust offense which punishes poaching more effectively. I've dived deep into these concepts, and I've talked about hexagons, and I've drawn up flowcharts and such, so that you don't really have to, right? You can just apply the principles to your game, and if you're coaching players, you can just give them the end results. Like, here's the lesson learned. I thought I'd basically show my working with all these videos. It's not that surprising that some traditional Ultimate players will see Hex and just lump it together with any other offense that isn't based upon a vertical line of players. And ultimately, I'm probably not the best person to explain Hex to them, as I'm too deep into it at this point. But as Hex spreads around the world and it's taught to youth teams and masters are playing it, then I hope the deep dive that I've taken will continue to bear fruition for these players. You've been watching mostly Goldfingers playing, with a bit of my team Zimmer sprinkled in. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you again soon.
He's trying to belt it for the back of the end zone to finish in style, and Yaraush duly does the honours, catches for the goal, and that will do it this game, with Goldfingers taking a well-earned 15-10 victory here.